In this world filled with mystery and betrayal, Mila finds herself trapped among the werewolves, her fate closely intertwined with the powerful Alpha Roman. How did she go from being an ordinary hunter to a chosen sacrifice, and how will she face the challenges ahead? Can she uncover the secrets hidden in her bloodline to change her destiny? Explore the secrets of the Wolf Moon. Subscribe to join the adventure. Chapter 4. Nobody threw food at me. In fact, no one even really looked at me. I found my time on the shame table quite boring. Besides sitting on my knees, I found I could lay down if I wanted, roll around with some difficulty, and could spend my time playing with the chains of my shackles. I was lying on my back, twisting the chain around my wrist repeatedly when something clanged against the table next to my head. I jumped with surprise, twisting quickly to find a bowl of soup placed in front of me. I stared at it a moment and looked up to find someone standing in front of the table, leaning against what appeared to be a lance of some kind. She looked familiar to me. Her hair was dark red, like blood, unlike the lighter ginger my family inherited. She had it tied down her back in a braid. And her eyes were alight, illuminating blue like sapphire gems. Looking into them, I recalled where I saw them before. "You were the Black Wolf," I declared, now completely suspicious of her. "I was," she stated, a sort of quiet grace in her tone that said she didn't raise her voice often. "That is, unless it's a loud, alerting howl in the night." She lifted a hand from her weapon and pointed to the bowl. "I've brought you food. You called them to me in the hunt." I continued with distrust. "Yes, well. They were quite distracted by rabbits." She suddenly smiled at me as I widened my eyes. To avoid admitting I rubbed my blood all over those poor bunnies, I reached for the bowl of soup and began eating it with vigor. I was pretty much starving. "My name is Kate," she introduced herself easily. I didn't stop to give my name, but continued eating while looking at her suspiciously. Despite her more serious aura, she seemed curious and playful. If anything, it was like having my aunt trying to cheer me up when I was a child. It was strange. "What's your name?" I finally stopped and frowned. "Milena. Everyone calls me Mila." "Mila, huh? What do you think of Alpha Roman so far?" "He's an asshole." I continued to finish the soup, ignoring Kate's laugh. When I was done, I looked at her carefully. She was clothed in a uniform of sorts. Along her waist was a blade probably no longer than her forearm, and the lance she leaned on held a sharp and impressive tip. "I'm a warrior wolf," Kate explained to me before I could ask, straightening herself before posing with her lance. It took me a moment before I realized as she twisted and turned that she was being downright silly. I frowned at her for a moment, but when she fainted a trip and then steadied herself, a smile slipped onto my lips despite myself. "Are you really a warrior? What's that supposed to mean?" she asked me, pretending offense. I watched as she looked over her shoulder at the empty mess hall where previously lichens had fed and otherwise peered at me curiously. "They wouldn't throw anything at you because you proved yourself superior to them. And also because they think you are blessed by the mother." I hesitated. "Who's the mother?" Kate smiled with amusement, but humored me. "She's the moon goddess, or rather one of them. Apparently you called out for her just before you challenged them all, including Alpha Roman," Kate informed me simply. "I called out for my mother," I finally admitted with frustration. "I wouldn't tell anyone that, if I were you." She straightened herself once more before glancing at me a final time. "Good luck in your fight against the Alpha. Should be a pretty interesting one, considering." Without explaining what was to consider, she walked away swiftly and left me on my own. Time passed slowly. Others might have felt more unease at sleeping on such surfaces, but I was used to camping in the harsh wild for weeks at a time when food was scarce in my village. Lichens came and went. Some, like Kate, began offering me foods and drink at random. I was able to leave my position only to use the restroom, and even that I felt was something I wasn't supposed to be allowed to do. It felt strange to be a sacrificial human in the midst of gods and being treated as some sort of creature to be wary of. I was certain this would be something that would change once this challenge was completed. After what I counted to be 3 days, the wounds on my stomach felt absent. I had removed the bandages to play with the remains of the wound, now pink scars, that was sensitive to the touch. It was strange how quickly I had healed from such a wound. Not even I could explain it. I began thinking about how exactly I would fight off the King Alpha. Just before the hunt, he spoke of humans using horrific weapons on the werewolves. We used to know how to easily harm the deity shapeshifters, but so long ago, we had been isolated and all things related to the packs were considered taboo. As long as we worshipped and gave our sacrifices, we wouldn't be wiped out entirely. The knowledge of what those weapons had been were far gone. I did manage to kill one in the hunt, though. I still got chills when thinking of it. Obviously, injury to the brain was enough to end them. I suspected a direct hit to the heart might possibly do something as well. But as for other injuries considered deadly to humans, I doubted it. I was considering how I might manage to set the King Alpha on fire when my thoughts were interrupted. Alpha Roman has accepted your challenge and announced to all that it will be completed now that you're full health, a man said to me, catching my attention. I immediately sat up, twisting to peer at the man, the same lichen that had allowed me to keep my knife for the hunt. I wondered if he regretted it. And when did he announce this? I asked, bewildered. 2 days ago, the man replied simply before reaching for my chains. What? When is this challenge thing happening? Now? I just told you. I gaped at him. He released my shackles, freeing my rather sore wrists at last. Instead of climbing off of the table, I stayed put. Can I back out of the challenge? I asked him, as though I could bargain with the Alpha through him. This man appeared to follow the King Alpha around a lot. Perhaps it meant he was important. He looked big enough to be almost as scary as the Alpha. His brown hair was rather long and loose to his shoulders. Who knew? You can, he admitted simply, holding out his hand palm up for me pointedly. Just bare your neck to him. What? But he'd just ripped my neck out, I exclaimed with exasperation. That is the point, the man answered, a look of solemn boredom set on his features. His eyes were a dark blue hazel, and they conveyed his attempt to view me as a dead woman who just didn't know it yet. I frowned unhappily at his hand. What's your name? I asked, reaching for his hand at last and moving off of the table. I wasn't hunting you, so I avoided your challenge. I'm not required to answer, he responded simply. I stared at him momentarily, as he led me out of the building. I recalled how he had yanked me from my family and life, thrown me against a wall, and jokingly allowed me to keep my weapon during the hunt, as if to rub it in my face that I wouldn't survive. You didn't hunt me. It was surprising. I have my reasons, he shrugged, unimpressed. I would offer my neck if I were you. If you win, you'll be challenged by every powerful wolf in this pack and all the others. Well, I can't win, can I? I muttered unhappily. We stepped into another building, walking through halls and ultimately arrived at a set of double doors. I could hear the lichens behind it already. When the doors opened, I was shoved into what looked like an arena of sorts. The walls were lined with lichens, all of them chattering loudly, and a type of excitement thriving in the atmosphere. In the center was a massive space. Too much space, if you asked me. The floor was dirt, but I could still see evidence of past fights in the marks of claws left on the ground. In the space provided, I noted several stands which held weapons. I blanched further. It wasn't enough that he would have supernatural strength and abilities, but he could also use weapons against me. I had to remind myself that I could use them as well. I was shoved forward once more, finding it suddenly extremely difficult to do so myself. To the right side of the area, the King Alpha stood watching me emotionlessly. I stiffened, lifting my chin and taking the shortest, choppiest steps to the opposite direction. I was a sacrifice, after all. I should have expected to die sooner than this. I just didn't think it would be at the stake of my own fighting abilities. Call it, Beta Caleb, the King Alpha suddenly snarled as I found my position across him, the massive space still not enough distance between us in my opinion. Yes, Alpha Roman, the man who had brought me here responded. Ha, Caleb. I felt a triumph, however small it was. He turned to me expectantly. Do you have anything you wish to say or do before we start the challenge? I felt all eyes on me as the air silenced, waiting for my response. My heart thudded in my chest painfully, fear and adrenaline pulsing through me wildly. I wanted to opt out of the challenge, of course. But I also felt that same determination, as I had when I ran through the forest, trying to survive. I made a promise to fight. I might not have been a fighter or warrior for my own people, but I was a hunter. I had killed a deity werewolf once already. What's an Alpha King? I targeted the King Alpha determinedly. Prepare yourself, I told him, my voice trembling as I shifted my feet in a way to stabilize my center more. For a moment, an undefined expression crossed his features as he watched me, as if I were a surprise to him. He no doubt had expected me to wimp out immediately. The Beta, Caleb, turned to look at the ground between us. I felt my breath go light, my mind lifting above me as though my reality was no more palpable than a dream. Start, Caleb barked swiftly. The word froze me. I had expected to run for a weapon immediately, but my feet were lead under me. This was it. I was dead. Alpha Roman stood where he had been left, unmoving as well. He didn't take his eyes off of me, his body just as stiff. I couldn't understand it. I was petrified. Why didn't he attack me? My feet came back to me as fast as I had lost them. In a span of a breath, I turned heel and ran for the nearest weapon stand. I heard him before I saw him and I quickly dropped to the ground like a sack of potatoes, crying out in fear as he flew over me. I shoved myself to my feet, reaching the weapon stand and lifting the bow I had spotted easily. I slung the case of arrows over my shoulder, and was promptly slammed into, thrown across the dirt ground roughly enough to lose my breath. However, it wasn't as hard as the wolf had hit me in the forest. And there were no claws involved. He was holding back. His loss. I rolled the minute I hit the ground, the bow now firm in my hand, and strung an arrow with such ease that it felt like another extension of me. The King Alpha stood just feet away, towering and still in human form. Spotting my weapon, an expression of amusement graced him, as though he found my attempts humorous. I aimed for his heart, breathing lightly. He disappeared in a blur, not running towards me, but not running away either. He was mocking me. However, I had great instincts. I released the arrow with deadly precision, equipping another without hesitation to release this one as well. Both hit him, missing him just inches below his heart, and caused him to freeze in mid-step. With him stunned, I aimed for his eye, preparing for the kill, while he was still processing the fact that I was able to hit him while running. I pulled the string, tightening my core in preparation, and then hesitated. Why was I hesitating? Let go. Let go. Alpha Roman disappeared from his spot and was suddenly there, knocking the bow from my hand with a dangerous growl. He grasped my arms and threw me the opposite direction of my weapon, causing me to land particularly roughly. I laid gasping for air, my heart exploding in my chest. Behind me, the Alpha was ripping the arrows from his abdomen, snarling as he did so. Blood spilled from his stomach to the ground, where he threw the arrows and promptly stepped on them. I stood up painfully, something in my own abdomen damaged by the throw. When he began to approach me, I suddenly lifted my hand, reaching into that part of me that felt a connection to the animals around me. "Stop," I told him, my voice high and frightened. There were gasps surrounding us, as that power rose around me immediately, demanding to be obeyed. Alpha Roman hesitated, lifting his face to breathe in the air around him curiously. His body stiffened under my order, and I focused my entire attention on willing him to remain where he was. "Now this is a fight," he growled deviously, an excitement flushing over his entire form, as though he had been waiting for me to do this very thing. "I don't want to fight," I said truthfully. "Then offer me that throat of yours, Milena," Alpha Roman suggested, the idea quite appealing to him for some reason. I didn't trust him, but I knew I couldn't win this fight. He had tossed away those arrows as if it were nothing to him. And he could move so fast there was no way I could accurately hit him. "Would you kill me if I did?" I asked uncertainly. "Offer your neck and find out," he responded, his voice low and dangerous. I could feel the adrenaline wearing off into something more of fearful uselessness. But still, I didn't trust him. I shook my head firmly, not willing to chance it. "If you want my neck, you'll just have get it yourself." "The hard way, then," he stated, taking a firm step forward. "Don't move," I shouted, forcing him to stop. "Step back." He stumbled over a step backwards and snarled loudly, his form beginning to change in front of me. He growled loudly at the snap of bone, as his hands malformed and became claws. And then he took a few more steps towards me. "Stop," I said quietly, my focus more on my order than my volume at this point. He paused again, huffing as he fought against my demand. I had never used this connection like this before meeting the werewolves. So often it was just me, reaching out to calm dying animals or to call them to me. It was too easy for them, but for this man it was something else entirely. I began to struggle to keep my breath. "Shift," he suddenly demanded of me, his own form half changing in front of me. I was startled by his own demand. I suddenly felt something else pushing back towards me, a separate power lifting around us. The werewolves watching seemed to be reacting to his order, as many began to change forms immediately. "Shift! I'm not a lichen," I cried out in frustration, but just as I said it, a terrible chill crawled under my skin like something within me reaching out to touch the surface of my body. A scent enveloped me, the smell of a wild animal, powerful and of the forest. I gasped, my focus dropping entirely. Just as quickly, the King Alpha was on me, twisting me to the ground. He suddenly smelled different as well. He smelled like pure power, untamed and seductive, something that caused a drug-like sensation to thrill through me. As he pinned me to the ground, he lowered his face into my chest with a low growl in his throat. I reached for him absently, pulling his face to mine and rubbing my cheek against his, and inhaled his addicting scent, as though I had become something wild myself. I lifted my face away, baring my throat quite suddenly for an entirely different reason than admitting defeat in a challenge. I was submitting. It was as though I had been possessed by this. Whatever it was that crawled dangerously within me. "I won't accept it," the King Alpha growled from above me dangerously, anger radiating behind his curious desire. I aimed to look at him, withdrawing my neck, but he immediately grasped my hair in his hand and pulled my face upwards, keeping my throat bare to him dominantly. I gasped, that wild part inside me delighted by it, until his next words. "I don't know what those wretched goddesses are planning, but I won't play along. You are not my mate." He suddenly bit my neck, causing me to yelp in surprise. However, I didn't feel the pain of wolf fangs digging into my flesh. In fact, he barely bit down, using only his human teeth lightly in a way to purposely not break my skin. It was a clear indication, but I didn't know what it meant. He released me, ripping away from me as though it were a difficult thing to do. "Take her away," he demanded to those nearby, huffing with rage and no longer looking at me. I remained frozen on the floor of the arena, the strange scents and sensations leaving me all at once until I was nothing more than confused. I wasn't a lichen, but if I wasn't, what had happened to me? Banish her to the temple. Let the moon goddesses watch her wither away. Perhaps they'll view it as a sacrifice direct to their altar, he declared angrily before storming away. I was pulled from the ground swiftly. What lichens remained in human form were murmuring around me, whispering things about mates, blessings, and omens. Some were staring at the bow I had left on the ground. Others were looking to the sky blindly, as if they would be struck down by angry deities at any moment. The rest watched me, avoiding my eye when I looked to them, but holding the same general expression on their faces. Respect. Chapter 5. I was led by 2 lichens and a rather somber Caleb, or Beta Caleb, as he had been called. We halted in front of what appeared to be a completely run-down and abandoned, enormous building on the outskirts of the lichen village. I didn't fight against my fate. In fact, I spent the entire walk towards it in a daze of confusion. However, when seeing the building before me and realizing I was being banished to starve to death within it, I finally found my footing for sanity. I'm not going in there, I declared firmly quite suddenly. The building windows were boarded up and those boards had bars twisted horribly over them. The door was crossed with metal slabs to prevent entry, and even without those, chains with locks were wrapped around the door handles. Remnants of what could have been statues were shattered and ripped from parts of the edge of the roof, and it looked as though a symbol had been vandalized several feet up from the front doors. This place looked nothing like a temple, and if it had ever been once, it definitely was one no longer. You lost the challenge. Your lucky Alpha Roman didn't just rip you apart, Caleb told me simply, though a sense of unease was shrouding his words. I turned to look at him. He was looking at the would-be temple with an expression of regret, or otherwise discomfort. A glance at the other 2 lichens revealed different emotions, looks of distaste and hatred. Why is it abandoned? Did you make a new temple somewhere else? I abruptly inquired, curious about their reaction towards the place. Caleb turned to look at me, careful not to reveal any further expression. We don't follow the moon goddesses anymore. All temples have been ordered abandoned. It's safe to assume you won't receive any visitors here, he responded shortly before indicating for the others to open the door. It took a couple of minutes to remove all the barricades. When they finished, they opened one of the doors to the temple and moved away. I'm definitely not going in there, I repeated firmly. Caleb abruptly ducked under me, lifting me from the ground and over his shoulder, as though I were a bag of feathers. I screeched and punched his back, struggling viciously against him. Let me go, you. You jerk. I got my wish when he suddenly dropped me to the floor. I was able to catch one more glance of his face, one of hesitation, before the door to the temple was shut in mine. I cried out in panic, pushing myself to my feet and trying to open it senselessly. No. Wait. Don't leave me in here. Let me out. The door was firmly shut. From the outside, I could hear the clangs of them replacing the barricades, fully intending to carry out the King Alpha's orders. I felt cold all over suddenly. Surely this was a joke. After everything, this couldn't be the way I went. I leaned against the door and slid down to the floor in momentary defeat. I cradled my head in my hands, taking a moment to take in my situation and think of a way around it. I would just have to look for an escape. And then I could run back to my village. If I could figure out which direction that was in. Either way, I wasn't going to find an exit by sitting where I was. I opened my eyes, leaned my head back, and then hesitated. My eyes were greeted by the beginning interior of the temple. Where I had thought it would be as trashed and otherwise as harmed as the outside, I was completely wrong. I stood slowly, taking in the initial mural on the wall immediate to the entrance. It depicted three silhouettes of women standing atop an ocean of trees, each of them looking to the sky with their hands lifted. And in their grip was three moons, a waxing, full, and waning moon. I stepped forward, lifting my fingers to brush over the artwork curiously. The entrance gave me an option to go left or right, though I was certain either way would lead to the same place. I picked a direction at random and began walking. It would have been completely dark inside, except that the light of day peeked through some boarded windows. I entered another stretch of a room, which held more art, and two sets of double doors along the center wall. The room held a mix of statues depicting wolves, half-shifted lichens, and more figures of the three women. One statue was of a woman holding a moon in her hands, a circle of wolves under her with their heads tilted back howling. Another statue was a woman with a bow and arrow, pointing at something in the distance while a large wolf stood protectively next to her. I touched the arrow tip carefully before turning to try one of the double doors. The doors led to an auditorium of sorts. There were rows after rows of pews in front of a massive stage. On the wall of the stage was a large symbol, black and solid. It appeared to be a circle with two crescent shapes on either side, facing the opposite direction. I walked further into the area curiously, looking up and around me at all the paintings of wolves and moons around the entire temple. It took me a minute to realize there were lighted candles along each pew. When I noticed, I suddenly paused to stare at one. My eyes moved from the candles to the chairs, which were absent of dust or dirt. In fact, the entire place appeared very well taken care of for something that was considered abandoned. Then again, I wasn't sure how long ago it was abandoned. But I was certain it wouldn't have only been a few hours, or however long it would take for candles to die out. There was a sound of movement and a door closing. I immediately ducked down in panic, hiding from whoever was in the temple with me. Then I peeked from over the pew towards the sound of footsteps. A woman was stepping onto the stage towards a table set up in the center. She placed two bowls next to plates that were already prepared with food. Then she sat facing the pews and took a drink from one of the two glasses set as well. I was suspicious. Did this mean there were even more wolves hiding here? "Won't you join me, Mila?" the woman suddenly asked loudly, her voice echoing throughout the room with ease. I ducked once again, trying to hide despite being found. Then I had to wonder how she knew my name. Maybe everyone knew my name by now. "You don't want your food to get cold, do you?" At the mention of food, especially food meant for me, my stomach rolled over with excitement. If anything could influence me to do something crazy, it would be food. I took a breath and stood stubbornly, glaring at the strange woman suspiciously. "What are you doing here?" I asked her before taking a step. "I live here," she responded simply, as if that weren't the nuttiest thing out there. I frowned, but my eyes traveled from her to the food in front of her. It looked fresh and downright delicious from where I was standing. "Come join me and we'll talk, Mila. Then I'll tell you how you can get out of here." "There's a way out?" I asked, instantly intrigued further. She merely smiled and continued to eat without me. I began to approach the stage hesitantly, pausing occasionally before taking the steps onto the platform, and finally seating myself across from her. I looked from her to the food carefully, taking in the soup in the bowl and the meat and vegetables on the plate. I picked up the silverware and quickly began to dig in, deciding poison would be worth the risk. I was hungry. The woman was older, probably in her high 40s or low 50s. She had graying blonde hair, but looked quite healthy and stunning. Her eyes were the darkest of sable, which held something of ancient wisdom within them, as she watched me feast in front of her. She sipped from her glass easily, waiting for me to finish. My eyes traveled from her to the symbol on the wall once again. "It's the symbol of the triple goddesses," the woman abruptly explained to me. I looked back to her curiously, as she moved her hand to the center of the table where the symbol had been etched onto the surface. The woman traced it slowly and said, there's the maiden, Artemis, represented by the waxing moon. Then the mother, Selene, represented by the full and new moon. And last is the crone, Hecate, represented by the waning moon. They are the three goddesses of the moon. I stared at the symbol for a moment, recognizing only the mother, as it appeared the wolves believed me to be blessed by her. I recalled reaching my hand out to the full moon, but then I shook my head briefly. It was all a bunch of nonsense. The wolves said they don't follow the moon goddesses anymore. I said with a frown, "What are you doing here?" The woman sat back and smiled warmly. "I'm one of the crone's oracles," she explained to me with ease. "Alpha Roman had us all banished from the packs long ago. Many of us survive, whether living as I do in secret among the temples or in hiding in the wild. But as for why I'm here right now, I've been waiting for you, Mila." I didn't know what to think. To be told that she was waiting for me, supposedly at the behest of the moon goddesses, was just strange. The goddesses weren't my goddesses, so what did I care to learn of them? Humans worshipped only the godlike lycanthropes, as was demanded since centuries before I was born. But something interested me about these creatures and the deities they used to worship. However, I didn't know this woman, so I had to remain wary despite my curiosity. The crone's oracles. What's that? I asked suspiciously. The crone, Hecate, is the goddess of the oracles. Through us, the words of the moon goddesses are heard among all the packs. We are given visions and told information, to keep us in the triple goddesses' favor, and to retain their blessings. The woman paused somberly at a thought that crossed her mind, yet, after being banished, many oracles lost their visions and connection to the goddesses. Of what I know, I'm the only one who retains a connection. What's your name? I asked curiously. You can call me Cynthia. I'm sorry if this is a bit much for you, and it doesn't help that for everything I tell you, there is infinite more you must know that hasn't been said, she explained with empathy. I stared at her a moment, trying to take in everything she'd told me so far and determine if there were falsehoods evident in her words. I leaned back, looking up and around once again. Where did you get this food from? The King Alpha sent me here to starve to death. I narrowed my eyes bitterly at the thought of such a sentence. It served him right, that there were people living under his nose ruining his plans. This temple has always had a preserve of food in the basement, meant to survive quite some time in case of food shortages. I'm certain Alpha Roman was in such a hurry to shut the place down that he completely failed to recall this fact, Cynthia stated before adding carefully, or he knew of it and hoped you would find it. Why would he hope that? I asked, appalled. He has done nothing but repeatedly attack me and sentence me to crazy punishments for existing. I do not wish to pretend I understand the Alpha's thoughts. But regardless, he is the reason you are here. Because of his actions, the moon goddesses have chosen you, Cynthia explained further. I gaped at her, my mouth opened in disbelief. And then I closed my mouth and scoffed. They made a poor choice. Once I get out of here, I'm going straight back home. You would risk the life of all of humankind for this. I would risk my life. I'm not sure how all of humankind is at risk because of this. I sputtered over my words, confusion and frustration motivating me. I immediately reached for my glass, downing the drink quickly in anxiety. I'm here to warn you, Mila Young. The path Alpha Roman is taking is one of destruction. It spells an end to both the humans and the wolves. The werewolves have already lost the blessings of the goddesses. If he continues on this path, it means extinction. For everyone, Cynthia had leaned forward, her hands gripping the table firmly and her words strained with intense sincerity. I had no doubt suddenly that she was speaking the truth. In fact, I felt a chill shudder through me, tasting the truth of her words. What does that have to do with me? I can't do anything. I'm just a girl, I asked, exasperated. However, I thought of my family. If she spoke the truth, the King Alpha would end all of them as well. My mother and father, my little brother, and everyone I knew and loved. Cynthia suddenly reached out for my hand. I hesitated, but lifted mine as well. She looked at my left hand, palm up, and peered at the birthmark on my hand openly. And then she lifted her other hand to place a blade and its sheath in my hand. It was the same one my little brother had given to me when I was chosen, as a sacrifice, the same one I had left buried in some woman's head. As for the sheath, I thought it taken from me after the hunt. I almost dropped it, but Cynthia kept a hold of my hand to prevent me from doing so. We are all just something. I am just an oracle wolf. You are just a girl. The Alpha is just a man with hatred in his heart. But you must find a way to stop him. She tightened her grip, looking up briefly with a faraway look in her eyes. The wolf moon has passed. If nothing has changed by the night of the hunter's moon, both the humans and lichens will fall. I widened my eyes. The hunter's moon, also known as the dying moon, was in October. It was the month of my 18th birthday. What was I supposed to do? And did I really believe the sake of all of humanity was at stake? What if this woman was just crazy and wanted me to risk my life so that she could stop living in hiding? But something in her words just felt true. I looked from her to the symbol once again. Sitting within the abandoned temple, it felt as though the moon goddesses were there watching me. I could feel their eyes and their expectations, demanding me to help their wolves despite the fact I was only human myself. It felt unfair. Fine, I submitted bitterly, I'll see what I can do. But not because of you or your deities. I am doing this for my kind, for the humans. We have always known you represent the humans, Mila. But you have felt that connection to the wolves and to Alpha Roman himself. In the end, you'll find you want to change this path for them as well, Cynthia said to me wisely, a secret behind her eyes that I wasn't privy to. She looked away, sadness creeping into her form. Both the humans and the wolves have suffered so much for so long now. I wanted to disagree. In fact, the wolves seemed quite content chasing me around to kill me for no reason. But then I recalled their faces of anger as they peered at the temple, and the King Alpha's rage as he looked into the moon. I recalled Beta Caleb's discomfort, his distancing from me, and the fact that he hadn't hunted me. I thought of Kate, who had spotted me but didn't attack me herself. Something told me not all the wolves agreed with the King Alpha's tactics. Let's get some rest. When we awake, I'll show you the secret passage. If you do decide to stay with the pack, you may visit me whenever you wish. But be careful, Cynthia stood slowly, looking around her adoringly. I'm not supposed to be here. I felt I wasn't supposed to be here, either. Chapter 6. I was stirred awake sometime in the night by Cynthia, who hovered over me quiet, as a ghost with a candle in one hand. She offered me her other hand and I took it without thinking, something about her presence comforting to me. With quiet determination, she began to lead me through the temple. I had rested in what appeared to be a housing area on the top floor of the temple across from Cynthia's room. She led me back down to the main level of the temple, where wolves had no doubt previously come to worship the goddesses and make offerings for their blessings. Now it was forever silent, removed from their culture. Cynthia led me further down a more secretive set of stairs until we were walking through storage units. I spotted shelves of canned foods and preserves, but wasn't given enough time to see exactly how extensive the food storage was. I was pulled to a rather dusty cupboard and led through the cobwebs until Cynthia stopped to quietly lift an overhead latch. She climbed the steps that would lead outside first and I looked up after her. I could see the night sky, stars studding it quietly, and the waning moon resting among them. As I looked at it, my immediate thought was Cynthia's words whispering about the crone and her oracles. I followed Cynthia up the steps, looking around briefly. The exit wasn't too far from the back of the temple, but well into the woods so that there was plenty of cover. The buildings of the lichen village were dark with sleep, though many lights flickered in the distance for those who were restless in the night. I stared only a moment before looking into the woods uncertainly. If you wish to return to your village, you'll want to go that direction. Cynthia lifted her candle towards the woods, pointing south with determination. Before turning those wise eyes on me, you'll walk straight into a creek. If you follow it east, it will lead to a river. Follow the flow of the river, and you will find your village. I looked from her to the direction she pointed once again, every cell in my body demanding that I abandon my position and return back to my family immediately. How long would it even be before the King Alpha went to check on me at the temple, if ever? If he didn't find me, wouldn't he just assume I died in a wall somewhere? I could hide every wolf moon among my people until eventually this entire situation was a bad, distant dream. But if Cynthia was right, if the goddesses told her the truth, my people would be facing a horrible doom in the future. They would perish by the month of my birth this year. I would no doubt go down with them. I reached for the blade, now firmly strapped around my leg once again familiarly. And if I wished to follow a different path? I asked Cynthia, turning my head just enough to look at her with determination. She had been watching me the entire time, waiting for me to make a decision, and satisfaction crossed her features briefly. The building you are looking for is there, she informed me, turning around completely to face the lichen village. She used her free hand to point at a taller building, well into the village, but still easy to see. She looked at me once again, and the room you are looking for will be on the second floor, the last door on the right. Cynthia stepped to me, lifting her hand to touch my face softly. No matter where you go, no matter what path you choose, the moon will always be with you, she told me, her voice hushed and kind. She moved her hand from my face and turned away. I watched as she re-entered the hidden path into the temple, gaining a last glance of her hair shining in the darkness, before she closed the door above her. The door was nearly invisible among the forest floor. I could understand why it was missed. I glanced into the forest once more, wanting more than anything to run for it. And then I turned away to begin my hunt for the King Alpha. I hid between buildings, moving as silently as possible. When having to run into the open, I kept low and watched for signs of life warily. As I moved closer to the building Cynthia pointed me to, I spotted a lichen walking out of a separate building. I quickly ducked down, my hand on the hilt of my blade carefully. When the lichen walked past without glancing in my direction, I waited until they were out of sight before proceeding. It took some time to get to the building I wanted, and when I did, I spent a considerable more amount of time staring at it determinedly. It appeared either unoccupied or the occupant was sound asleep. The former would have been preferred. I looked around once more, and when satisfied that the area was vacant, I crept towards the building easily. The front door was too in the open, and it was likely it would be locked. I stayed against the wall of the building, hidden from view, and reached above me to try a window. The first one wouldn't budge. I tried two more before finding one that opened under my touch. My heart was pulsing loudly in my throat as adrenaline began to pump determinedly throughout me. I lifted the window further and then twisted around, sheathing my blade before gripping the window ledge firmly. I looked into the building carefully, not spotting any signs of movement. And then I lifted myself up and through the window, feeling like a bandit, a mad, insane bandit. I planted a foot on the floor of the house carefully, my bare feet silent in the air. When I was fully inside the building, I shut the window to prevent wandering eyes from wondering if someone might be in their fearless leader's house. I snuck through the building slowly, avoiding any and all furniture. I found the stairs and followed them to the second floor. I looked left briefly, my eyes taking in the hallway with a few doors. Then I turned right, walking purposely. The last door was already partially opened, which felt like a bad omen to me. That or the goddesses had used some voodoo to open it for me. Here, they might be whispering, he's in here. Sick him. I opened the door further, slipping into the room despite the fact that my heart was panicking. My sight was greeted by a sleeping form atop of a large bed. The King Alpha was lying on top of the sheets, positively spread out and resting with ease. It was as if he hadn't just sentenced some innocent girl to die a horrible death of starvation in an abandoned temple. I got mad just looking at him, his scarred yet handsome face sleeping peacefully. I crouched slightly, removing the blade from its sheath quietly. Then I began to move towards the King Alpha slowly. He was shirtless, revealing even more battle scars across his chest under the moonlight. If I had to guess, I wasn't the first person to attempt to assassinate him. It made me nervous. He was centered squarely on the bed, far from the edges, as if to purposely make it harder to carry out the deed. I hesitated when I reached the bed, looking from the edge to him with unease. I was fit enough to have more strength in my blows than most girls in my village, but I would still need 2 hands if I wanted to drive my blade into his heart as intended. At the same time, I couldn't touch the lichen or else he would definitely wake up. I crawled onto the edge of the bed carefully, holding my breath, as it sank under my weight. When the King Alpha didn't move, I moved closer to him, blade still in hand. I expected him to wake any second and thought perhaps I should come up with a backup story, but nothing came to mind, so I only proceeded. When I was close enough, I hesitated a moment longer. I could try stabbing him from the side, but I had approached him from his right side, my left. It meant I would have to reach further over him to hit his heart. I would probably miss or not be able to put all my strength into it. I closed my eyes for a moment, tightening my hands into fists stubbornly. And then I began to move even closer to him. I lifted my body lithely over him until I was straddling his form, keeping myself raised enough not to touch him completely. Now satisfied by my position, I gripped the blade with both of my hands, holding it above his chest for a moment. I aimed for his heart, hesitated, and began to shift the blade in a way that would avoid the scars already on his chest. I wasn't sure why I didn't want to disturb them, and the thought was enough to frustrate me. Abandoning my attempt to be nice, I lifted the blade above my head. I stayed in this position, poised for my attack, for a moment longer than necessary. It was like when I had an arrow trained on his eye. Do it, I demanded of myself, but again my body refused to listen. I tightened my grip over the blade over and over again, my body tightening under it as well. I must have moved above him, enough to move against him. Suddenly, his eyes flew open, those steel blues reflecting the moonlight, as they found me above him. I struck, aiming for his heart blindly. He immediately reached for my wrists, snatching them in his grip dangerously before rolling over me roughly. I lifted my knee, slamming it repeatedly into his abdomen, as best as I could, and tilted my wrists under his grip to prevent the blade from piercing me instead. His tightening grip demanded I drop it, but I firmly refused. I wanted to scream, finding myself in a brawl, but my mouth remained closed with focus as I fought his powerful form. I felt the edge of the bed below us, and I thrust my entire body into throwing us off entirely. I heard the satisfying collision of his head against the bedside table, as he released me with a grunt. The blade fell across the floor unhelpfully, and I immediately crawled hastily for it. Just as I nearly reached it, hands gripped the back of my legs and pulled me out of reach. I was suddenly pinned under him, his hips holding mine down and his legs tight around mine to prevent me from movement. I immediately tried to knee him between his legs, but he easily saw it coming and shifted to avoid it. He moved to prevent me from attempting further attacks on his lower regions. I used one hand to grab his ear viciously and the other to slam into his nose as hard as I could manage, but my target was offset by the struggle, and it wasn't as hard as I would have liked. Still, he growled at the resulting pain, blood already leaking from his head from my previous attack. He pinned my dominant hand on the floor above me while I continued my attack on his ear. When he targeted that hand, I immediately began to claw at his face, which drew frustrated snarls from his throat as he bared dangerous fangs at me. He ripped my hand from his face and pinned that with the other, roughly pulling them both under my head until I had to lift my chin to avoid the discomfort of the position. We were suddenly left silent and panting on the floor of his room, my body officially incapacitated under his dominating grip. I wanted to kick myself. I should have ran back to my village after all. I wasn't a secret assassinator of lichen kings. It was stupid of me to think I could even manage it. "You're supposed to be locked up in the temple," Alpha Roman abruptly growled, frustration painting his features. But at the same time, there was something of a delight in his expression, as though he were pleased to see me here. At first, I thought it mad, but then when evaluating my own emotions I felt a form of excitement in having him close to me as well. Perhaps it was this strange insanity that had prevented me from performing killing blows when available. I got out, I stated the obvious, narrowing my eyes at him firmly. "You got out and you didn't run home. Instead, you thought you would come kill me in my sleep." He turned his gaze from me to the blade just out of my reach. He lifted his free hand and grabbed it, causing my heart rate to increase exponentially. "How'd you know where I slept?" "I'm a hunter, remember?" I responded sharply, squirming under him when he lifted the blade over me. He didn't appear to believe my excuse and began to run the blade over my side slowly. "Who told you where I sleep?" Alpha Roman asked me dangerously, following the blade with his eyes pointedly. I began to panic, trying to think of anything that wouldn't get Cynthia in trouble with him. I'm. I faltered momentarily, and then winced when he pulled my wrists further under me roughly. I had a vision from the crone. He paused then, looking up from the blade and instead peering at my face. "Are you claiming to be of the oracles?" he asked me, his voice low with growing impatience. Something told me this was both the wrong and right answer. I shook my head and then also nodded hesitantly. "The goddesses wish me dead, now. Is this what you're telling me?" I didn't answer this question. A chuckle rumbled through him, demented, angry, and at the same time amused. Something in my soul liked his laugh, despite the darkness of it. It pulled at that wildness inside me, drawing it to the surface until the King Alpha froze against me. He inhaled briefly before holding his breath determinedly. "You're tempting my wolf, Milena," he growled at me dangerously. "I don't mean to," I whispered, my voice strained under such an unusual feeling. "There might have been a time when I asked the goddesses for a mate several years ago," he continued, shifting forward to breathe in my scent deeply. After a moment, he lifted the blade from my side and I whimpered, afraid he would turn it on me. Instead, he abruptly turned it on himself, driving it squarely into his heart with an angry grunt. I gasped at the sight. When he didn't drop dead above me, I felt like I truly had fallen into insanity. He ripped it from his chest as he had done my arrows, my blade now bloody, and his chest healing before me. When they refused to mate, I instead asked the goddesses to kill me. He dropped the useless blade on the ground and pulled one of my hands from under me roughly. I whimpered as he pressed my palm against his healing wound determinedly, a look of anger enveloping him. "It's been centuries, do you understand? It's been centuries and the crone refuses my life. She'll take everyone around me. She'll take you, even. But never me." I was staring at him with disbelief and horror, my initial thoughts stuck on the fact that Cynthia had sent me on a suicide mission. But then I truly took in his words and my eyes trailed from his to my hand on his chest. I stared at it for a moment and then began to move my touch over his other scars. They were wounds, caused by centuries of life. An immortal werewolf, it was a nightmare if I had ever heard one, both for him and for the humans. The challenge. Everything was pointless, I whispered, wanting to be disgruntled but distracted by his body so close to mine. That wild power flared within me, recalling the challenge and the feel of that thing within me. I was surrounded by the King Alpha's empowering scent, untamed and dangerous yet desirable. Aware of my own thoughts this time, I fought the urge to pull him to me and breathe him in as I had before. "You smell of human in one moment and wolf in another," the King Alpha said suspiciously, narrowing his eyes as he huffed above me with restraint. "Why would they grant me a mate now? And one which was among the humans? They must have stolen you from us. Or perhaps you were thrown out a defected wolf." He released his grip on my remaining pinned hand and planted both of his on the ground on either side of me. He lowered himself further until his lips were over my chest carefully. It would have been a perfect time to attack him, but I remained frozen under him. I was afraid if I moved, I would throw myself to him as I had before. "I'm not a wolf," I managed painfully. "We could find out for certain if you'd just shift," he growled the order dominatingly. I whimpered immediately, feeling that unfamiliar touch of something crawling under my skin. Yet no bones snapped and nothing changed on the surface. His scent became even more addictive around me, as though the closer I got to whatever connection was between me and the werewolves, the more drawn to him I was. "What's happening to me?" I asked him fearfully, as that power thrilled throughout me. He was still as a statue above me, his muscle tensed and poised as he watched me. A normal lichen would have shifted even if they didn't want to. "You've rejected me 3 times now," he stated simply, as though I had a choice in the matter. "What should I do with you, Milena?" I wanted to demand him to let me go home. But still Cynthia's warning ran through my head that I needed to stop this alpha before the hunter's moon. I obviously couldn't just kill him, as he proved tonight. There had to be something else I was missing. "Let me stay," I abruptly requested, an expression of surprise gracing my features before his. "No," he growled angrily in response. His hands tensed into fists against the ground. "If you're an oracle wolf, or even a defect wolf, I should banish you immediately." "I'm not a defect," I snapped in irritation. "What does that even mean?" "It means you were born with deformity that would render you useless to the pack." Missing legs perhaps, or he was peering at me, his focus beginning to fade. He shook his head firmly. "I'm not missing anything," I gasped, offended. "And that's just barbaric. You're not staying." "I would," he stopped himself from continuing, struggling with his own thoughts. I hesitated, thinking over everything I had learned about the lichens so far. And then I lifted my chin, revealing my neck to the King Alpha on impulse. He growled lowly, the sound vibrating along my body and reaching into that wild power within me. I wanted to crawl away, but I held still submissively. "Let me stay," I requested once again, swallowing with difficulty. I'll be your mate or whatever that is." "Is that what the goddesses requested of you, then?" he asked me with frustration, his hatred of his deities thick in his words. I wondered if it would be the right answer to deny this or to say it was true. The goddesses hadn't requested anything, really. I hadn't received any visions, but I couldn't very well admit that and keep Cynthia safe at the same time. "Then let's make them regret it," the King Alpha suddenly growled, grasping me firmly before lifting me to him roughly. I gasped in surprise and then cried out when he bit me viciously. His fangs burrowed into the curve into my shoulder, but it felt as though they went even deeper. I grasped at his arms tightly, whimpering against him as his bite bled into my soul possessively. That wild part of me was drawn out, thriving under his powerful bond. I could feel it just under my skin, settling and stretching over the length of me, as if making my flesh its home. For just a moment, I wondered if perhaps I was something else, something untamed and of nature itself. Yet my body remained human in the King Alpha's embrace. He ripped his bite from my flesh none too gently, panting with exhilaration. "You may be mine now, Milena," he snarled at me dangerously, "but make no mistake, I won't ever be yours." I struggled to take in air momentarily, reaching for my neck briefly. You bit me, I merely responded, obviously behind on times. And then I promptly fell into unconsciousness. Don't miss Mila's next hunting moment. Subscribe to stay updated.